This episode sponsored by CuriosityStream, which now comes free with Nebula. Details in the description box below. Hello and welcome history buffs, my name is Nick Hodges and here is part 2 of my Season 1 review for Narcos. Thank you all so much for your patience and I hope you enjoy. With American cash flowing in, Colombian President Barca was able to greatly enhance his special police units. One of them was called Bloc de Búsqueda, or the Search Block, and its sole mission was to hunt down the leaders of the Medellin cartel. It stood out from other units for its elite tactics and by being incorruptible. Absolutely none of its officers could be from Medellin or even Antioquia, and they couldn't work with local Medellin police because corruption was rampant. But while Search Block was being formed, the cartel mobilized their troops too. They recruited young boys out of the slums and sent them off to Sicario schools to learn how to shoot and ride motorbikes. Escobar then set up a bounty system to kill cops and any Search Block officers they could find.
For every dead cop I will pay $2,000. And for every sergeant I will pay $5,000. For every lieutenant I will pay $10,000. For every captain $20,000. For every major $50,000.
Within the first 15 days of Search Block's assembly, 30 of its 200 officers were killed. According to Javier Peña, Escobar would kill thousands of cops within his lifetime, then at one point would average 400 a year. This was not a job for the uncommitted. The Colombian government knew early on that they needed the right man to lead Search Block, and the one they picked was Colonel Hugo Martinez. Except in Narcos, Hugo Martinez is a character that doesn't pop up until Season 2. The guy who originally leads Search Block in the show is a made-up character called Horatio Carrillo, and he's largely based off of Hugo Martinez. Yeah, I know it sounds confusing. The reason why Narcos made up Carrillo and not use Hugo Martinez is due to his ruthless tactics fighting the cartel. Time and time again, we see him and his guys pull a Sicario off the street and torture him for information. Then once they get what they need, they kill him, all in front of the DEA agents. Throughout this period, there were many allegations of Colombian national policemen torturing and murdering suspects, often as payback for their fallen comrades. Steve Murphy addressed these allegations in the book Manhunters by saying, "When the CNP interviewed a defendant at the base, or anywhere for that matter, we were never present. The Colombian authorities would tell us verbally what they got out of the defendant, or give us an intelligence report. We were willing to overlook certain unorthodox procedures to get the job done, but neither Javier nor I ever crossed any lines." Most likely Javier Peña and Steve Murphy didn't cross any lines by design. If they didn't see anything, who's to say it even happened? In Mark Bowden's Killing Pablo, he tells one story about Hugo Martinez by saying, and I quote, "On one occasion, a Centrospike soldier reported that 2 men seized in a raid had been thrown from helicopters on the flight back to Medellin. He had not seen it done, but had heard several of Martinez's men joking about it. He confronted the colonel and was told, 'We were concerned they might have seen you.' When the Centrospike man protested, Martinez waved him away. 'Don't worry about it, it's not your concern.' When the soldier reported the incident to Jacoby, the major asked, 'Did you actually see them thrown from the helicopters?' 'No.' 'Good.' But like I said, these stories are unconfirmed, so whilst it's clear the showrunners wanted to adapt them, they're not going to outright say Hugo Martinez did these things, not without a mountain of lawsuits. So instead they made up 2 characters. One is Colonel Carrillo, who could do all the messed up stuff you want, and the other is Hugo Martinez, who's portrayed to be a more by-the-book kind of guy who believes the police should never cross the line.
We can catch Escobar in any number of ways, but if the one we choose furthers an already strained relationship between the Colombian people and its police, a strain caused by years of corruption and abuse, then we'll have lost, even if we catch him.
Your philosophy is our philosophy, Coronel.
So basically, the reason why I went on this little tangent is so you know that when I'm talking about Colonel Martinez, but I'm showing Colonel Carrillo, understand that they're the same guy. So back to what I was saying. When the government approached Colonel Martinez about leading Search Block, it wasn't a job he wanted. Nobody did. There were many more distinguished and experienced commanders than Martinez, but they used their influence to avoid it. The only way they convinced him to take it was because they told him his position would be rotated monthly with a new guy, which never happened. Of course, Martinez was initially showered with praise, but he quickly found these words of encouragement to be hollow, like when this happened to him.
La señora Quiroga me dijo que los vecinos de la cuadra hicieron una votación. Quieren que nos mudemos.
¿Pero cómo eso? Si tenemos guardaespaldas delante de la casa 24 horas al día.
Eso es lo que los asusta.
So Narcos changes things slightly. Martinez and his family lived in an apartment, not a house, when a bomb was found in the basement of the building. That's why their neighbors asked them to leave. It was discovered because someone called in a tip to the police, most likely as a warning. Now, interestingly, nearly all the occupants in Martinez's building were high-ranking national police officers. That's how they knew about his new job, because it was meant to be secret. But rather than supporting him and his family in their time of need, they kicked them out. Not long after, Martinez received a knock on the door when an old friend popped by, and, as accurately depicted in Narcos, this friend was sent by Pablo Escobar to bribe the colonel $6 million if he just backed off. Martinez kicked his friend out, and from that point on, he was marked for death, and from what I've researched, there were many attempts on his life. A chef was paid off to poison him, a police cadet was ordered to shoot him at the Carlos Holguin Academy, Martinez's home was firebombed, a car bomb was discovered on his route to work, and another bomb was discovered on a plane his family were flying on. But I couldn't find any reference to an attempt like we see in Narcos, where a Sicario tries to shoot him in a restaurant. I think that one's made up. However, the bit where we see Pablo Escobar personally threaten Martinez and how he was going to kill his entire family did happen. Well, close, they kind of tweak things a bit. In the show, Martinez phones Escobar and they both threaten to kill each other, but in real life, Martinez was listening to a wiretap, and when Escobar realized he was being recorded, he left a personal message for the colonel.
Gonorrea malparido, ¿por qué no recibe la plata más bien como todo el mundo? Podría tenerlo viviendo como un rey, pero ahora ¿sabe qué? Toca matar a su papá, su mamá, sus hijitos, toda su familia, que si su inteligencia lo permite suponer, los tengo perfectamente reconocidos y ubicados, gonorrea malparido.
But despite all this, Martinez accepted his lot with an iron resolve. He would capture or kill Pablo Escobar. He had the right manpower to see it through, he just needed to find him. And that's where the Americans came in. Probably the most valuable part of Bush's military package was an elite spy unit called Centrospike. In Narcos, Centrospike is depicted as a CIA-run operation, but it was actually created by the army for a specific type of intelligence gathering. Whereas your average spy knows how to influence and obtain data from an organization or foreign state, Centrospike specialized in finding people and providing real-time tactical information, like where the target is, who they're with, what kind of cars are they driving, that sort of thing. But they didn't typically get this data from informants, but through surveillance. Centrospike would listen to the conversations of their targets by picking up their radio and mobile phone signals and then use them to pinpoint their location within a few hundred meters. They do this with small commercial planes that look innocent from the ground, but inside they'd be jam-packed with state-of-the-art equipment. The operators inside would lock onto a signal, get a rough idea of its location, and then triangulate it with assets on the ground. The sheer volume of information that flowed from Centrospike to the DEA and to Search Block proved invaluable, and Colonel Martinez used every bit of it to get inside the head of his prey.
Pablo became his duty and his obsession. He came to recognize Pablo's voice, his sleep patterns, what he liked to eat, his taste in art, his love of silk sheets, and his favorite music.
Once Centrospike and Search Block started working together, they saw results immediately. On December 15, 1989, Rodriguez Gacha was tracked down to a beachside property in Tulum. And, as Narcos accurately depicts, his precise location was given away thanks in large part to Jorge Velasquez, aka El Navegante, who this whole time had been a spy for the Cali cartel. The only major change in this scene is that this raid takes place in Narcos before the Avianca bombing, when in real life it happened after. In any case, when Search Block assaulted the property, Gacha's 15 bodyguards opened fire, providing cover for him and his teenage son Freddy to flee away in their red Chevy. Then the pair were spotted by a police helicopter near Banana Grove, and when the helicopter was fired upon, the order was given to cut them down.
Dale plomo.
By taking out Rodriguez Gacha, the Search Block achieved their first major victory against the cartel. It taught them their shift in tactics was working, and over the next several months, they relentlessly pursued it. Coordinating with the DEA and Centrospike, they mounted dozens of raids and began to close in on Escobar's inner circle. On August 9, 1990, they dealt him a heavy blow by killing his cousin and right-hand man Gustavo Gaviria, who had been by Pablo's side since childhood. Officially, Search Block reported they had been killed in a shootout, but in Narcos, we see them capture Gustavo and beat him to death. But did this really happen? Well, in Mark Bowden's Killing Pablo, he says, and I quote, "The search block said he was killed in a shootout, which had become such a commonplace that up in the embassy vault, it was greeted with winks. The expression killed in a shootout with the police was regarded as a euphemism for summary execution." Pablo claimed there had been no shootout, that his cousin had been captured, tortured, and then executed by the colonel's men.
Registren su muerte como si hubiera fallecido en una balacera con la policía. Escribe en tu reporte que él disparó primero.
Coronel está todo golpeado.
¿Satisfecho?
Here's another one of those stories that remains unconfirmed. After all, Pablo Escobar was a pathological liar, but then again, who knows? The only thing I do know for sure is that this episode would have been possible without our sponsor, CuriosityStream. It's a subscription streaming service that has nothing on it but documentaries, including history. One I found particularly interesting in my research for Narcos was King of Coca Land, a short film about the UN's attempts to fight the drug war by peacefully convincing coca farmers to give up their cash crop. A challenging task to say the least, and you can watch this documentary and thousands like it for just $2.99 a month. And the best part is that fans of history buffs have been offered a special 26% discount off their annual plan. That's less than $15 for an entire year of content. And what's more is that with CuriosityStream, you'll also be getting Nebula for free, another streaming service that has content from many creators, including history buffs. It's a platform without the restrictions of advertiser-friendly policies you'd find elsewhere. So basically, any videos of mine that need to be heavily edited or go missing will have no problem being uploaded to Nebula, the way they were meant to be seen. To get started, all you have to do is enter the promo code curiositystream.com/historybuffs. On August 7th, 1990, just a couple of days before Gustavo's death, Cesar Gaviria became the next president of Colombia. The attempt on his life in the Avianca bombing won him the election by a landslide. He took to the role dutifully, knowing that over 100 people died just because he kept the same anti-narco policy Galan did. He owed it to them to see it through. But what Gaviria didn't know yet was just like Search Block, Pablo Escobar was also going to change tactics. He had been killing and bombing Colombia to hell and back, but the government still refused to negotiate. Clearly, terrorizing the public alone wasn't going to be enough to sway them.
Vos sos el que siempre me ha dicho que los políticos, la gente le importa un culo, ¿cierto? O sea que si vos querés influenciar a los políticos, vas a tener que ser mucho más específico.
That's when the extraditable stopped the bombings and started targeting the families of the elite, the media conglomerates, giants of industries, former presidents, oligarchs, the 1% that own the majority of Colombia's wealth, who, up until now, have been left relatively untouched. Not anymore. Pablo Escobar was going to kidnap their children, hold them to ransom, and then kill them, one by one until his demands were met. The most high-profile kidnapping was of the popular newscaster Diana Turbay on August 30th, 1990. She was also the daughter of former president Julio Turbay, which made this extremely delicate for Gaviria. Just weeks after taking office, he already faced enormous pressure to end the violence from outside, but now also from within. The families of the Bogotá elites got together and formed their own organization, the Notables. Their one objective: to give Pablo Escobar what he wanted.
Como expresidente, yo entiendo que usted está en una posición muy difícil, pero nosotros estamos aquí es para encontrar soluciones.
Entiendo su frustración, doctor Turbay. Pero si cedemos ahora, cualquier criminal va a hacer lo que le dé la gana en nuestro gobierno.
No, es que no estamos hablando de cualquier criminal. Estamos hablando del peor criminal del mundo. Y se está burlando de todos.
Presidente, usted está procediendo bien, pero nosotros tenemos que proceder como padres que somos.
And that was it. 1 week after Diana Turbay's kidnapping, President Gaviria began to negotiate. He started off by offering Escobar and the other drug lords immunity from extradition and reduced sentences if they surrendered and confessed. Now, this is what the extraditables had been fighting for since the beginning. You'd think they'd jump at the opportunity head first, especially with Search Block hot in their heels and having to fight the Cali cartel too. Around this time, on September 25th, 1990, they very nearly killed Pacho Herrera at a football game. Pablo Sicarios came onto the pitch and gunned down 18 players and Cali members, but Pacho escaped. A deal with the government was needed now more than ever, but that's not what happened. Every time President Gaviria made a concession, Escobar would make more demands. Gaviria would give in just a little bit, and it carried on like that for months, and every day people continued to die, and not always by Escobar's hands. There were often massacres committed by rogue cops who descend upon the barrios and round up young boys of fighting age and execute them. They wanted to whittle down Sicario recruitment and exact revenge for fallen comrades. It wouldn't be until 1998 before the Colombian government publicly acknowledged before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that its own police officers were responsible for one massacre in Villatina, in which 7 young men between the ages of 15 and 22 were murdered. None of the victims were gang-affiliated. By December 1990, President Gaviria offered the most generous deal yet, that if these drug lords confessed to even the most minor crime, they would be immune from extradition and serve a reduced sentence. And that was enough for the Ochoa brothers. Now, in the show, this deal is offered to them by Pacho Herrera because of the Cali cartel's political connections in exchange for giving up Gustavo Gaviria to Search Block. The reason they give him up is because they find out he's been shagging their sister, but this is completely made up. The only reason a deal was offered was because the government was reaching its breaking point and the Ochoa brothers had reached theirs. But the one thing that is accurate about this scene, it is this.
The Colombian government was willing to overlook their part in the largest cocaine empire on the face of the earth. Instead, they would serve reduced sentences. The charge? Illegally importing bulls from Spain. I shit you not.
So by this point, things weren't looking good for the Medellin cartel. Rodriguez Gacha was dead, Gustavo Gaviria was dead, the Ochoa brothers surrendered, and Carlos Leda had long since been arrested and extradited to an American prison. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention earlier that the scene in episode 4 where Carlos Leda was running Tranquilandia and arrested there, that didn't happen. He was arrested in 1987 due to a tip-off. Some people say it was ordered by Pablo because he killed his favorite bodyguard at a party. The only one left standing out of the original founding members was Pablo Escobar. Every day in his war fighting Cali and fighting the state, he was losing money and prestige. Running his cocaine empire on the run just wasn't feasible. But even so, his lawyers continued to negotiate to try and sweeten the deal. Even in his predicament, Pablo wanted to see how far he could take things. Then, on January 25th, 1991, Search Block unintentionally landed Escobar his greatest victory yet, when during a botched rescue attempt, they accidentally shot and killed Diana Turbay. With pressure mounting from the notables and a war-weary public, President Gaviria eventually caved in to all his demands. And so on June 19th, 1991, after 7 years of bloodshed, Pablo Escobar finally turned himself in. As to the conditions of his surrender and to end the violence, the Colombian constitution would be rewritten to outlaw extradition. He'd keep his multi-billion-dollar fortune, he'd confess to only one crime, and serve a 5-year sentence. But he'd do his time in a prison he'd built himself, called La Catedral, or the Cathedral. It was nestled in the mountains of his hometown of Envigado, outside Medellin. It was going to be run by his own guards, all its inmates would be his sicarios. No cops or Americans were allowed within 2 miles of the prison. Nobody was allowed to fly over it, and the best part? Search Block was to be disbanded. This was not a surrender, but appeasement. Pablo Escobar had taken on the Colombian state and won. His prison was anything but. I mean, from the outside it looked like one. It had watchtowers with a double fence, 15 rows of electrified barbed wire, except the switch for that was an Escobar cell. To enter the prison, you had to pass through army checkpoints along a winding dirt road that led to the top of the slope. But these were a joke. The soldiers would always wade through truckloads of contraband, transporting everything from prostitutes, liquor, drugs, lobsters, electronics, you name it. In the prison itself, they had a large rec room with arcade machines, pool, ping pong tables, with a little casino. There was a lounge with a bar, even a disco. Pablo's private cell, if you could call it that, was fitted with a kitchen, an office, a bedroom with a custom-sized bed, and a jacuzzi in the bathroom. For exercise, they had a gym with a sauna and a football pitch outside with lights installed to play at night. Pablo also smuggled in friends and family and hosted lavish parties. The one we see in the show was for his 42nd birthday on December 1st, 1991. He hired fine dining chefs from Medellin and they feasted on shrimp, octopus, stuffed turkey, and cake. They had a live band playing whose music reverberated over the mountainside. All of this under the watchful eye of the police and the DEA. Of course, they couldn't do anything to stop it, only monitor the situation and report back to Gaviria.
Antes Escobar era dueño de todo Colombia. Ahora solo es dueño de su propia cárcel. Si me dan a escoger entre prostitutas en la catedral o bombas en el país, le estaré eternamente agradecido a estas mujeres.
Inside his little kingdom, Pablo went back to rebuilding his empire, and soon he was trafficking more cocaine than ever before. He had the stipulations of a surrender to thank for that. The DEA couldn't get close enough to the prison to conduct any serious surveillance, and they couldn't intercept any communications leaving it. That was because Pablo got around this problem by either using homing pigeons, or he'd smuggle in his capos for face-to-face meetings. But despite living the high life, prison did have its drawbacks. For one thing, he was still at war with Cali. Regardless what the show says, there was never a ceasefire or a truce being negotiated. Medellin and Cali were constantly at each other's throats, and now they knew where to find him. But Pablo planned for this by carefully selecting the ground where the prison was to be built. The mountains fogged every day at dawn and dusk, which provided cover to escape and deterred any surprise aerial assaults. The only flat piece of land large enough for a helicopter landing was the football pitch, but Pablo had it booby-trapped with anti-helicopter wires. So the Cali cartel thought to get around this problem by dropping bombs from a helicopter onto the prison, but when Escobar discovered the plot, he ordered an anti-aircraft cannon. Another drawback beyond Pablo's personal safety was that prison life interfered with his ability to manage the cartel's daily operations. Before going inside, he gave a huge chunk of that responsibility to Kiko Moncada and Fernando Galeano. Both they and their families grew incredibly rich and powerful because of this, but this wasn't to last. Within a year, the pair would be murdered at the prison. Now, the sources seem to vary on how this exactly happened. The version we see in Narcos is mentioned in Steve Murphy and Javier Peña's book Manhunters. They said it all started when a buried bag of rotting cash was discovered on Kiko's property. Jealous of the Moncadas and Galeanos, Pablo Sicarios hatched a plot to kill them by telling Pablo his most trusted capos were holding out on him.
Los guerrilleros, los paras, los narcotraficantes, pues todo está enterrando plata.
Sí, yo sé, pero preciso en la finca de Moncada y Galeano. Usted no se le hace muy raro eso, patrón. A mí sí.
In that version of events, Kiko and Fernando were ordered to La Catedral to explain themselves. In Mark Bowden's book, Killing Pablo, he said that Pablo was the one who had grown jealous of Kiko and Fernando, that he was constantly putting them in their place, first by hiking up their war tax to excessive levels.
Yo igual necesito subir el impuesto. De ahora en adelante, 1 millón al mes.
But still feeling like he was owed more, Pablo ordered his men to steal an extra $20 million from their secret stash houses. Then Kiko and Fernando visited the prison to complain. It seems like Narcos is combining these two versions, but there's still one more. The final source I have is from Juan Pablo Escobar's book, Pablo Escobar, My Father, in which he says that he was personally told by his father that Kiko and Fernando had both been turned by the Cali cartel and were ordered to withhold financial aid to Pablo and provide intelligence. When Pablo discovered their betrayal, he lured them to the prison. Regardless which account is true, they all end the same way. They were both murdered by Pablo Sicarios, cut into pieces by chainsaw, and their bodies burned to ash. Then Pablo ordered a hit on their families for their properties and assets to be seized. And, according to Javier Peña, he even sent their widows their husbands' charred penises. In Narcos, it's Steve Murphy and Javier Peña who find out about this and leak it to the press. But it was actually the Moncada and Galeano widows. As their families prepared for civil war, they made the information public that their husbands had been murdered inside the prison. Pablo didn't know it yet, but he had just made one of his greatest mistakes. On Wednesday afternoon, July 21st, 1992, President Gaviria held a meeting with all his generals and ministers over what was to be done with Escobar. Turning a blind eye to prostitutes is one thing, but this was murder. If the Colombian government ignored this, then it too would be complicit, and its standing amongst other nations would be even further disgraced. But to take action would violate the agreement with the world's most powerful narco-terrorist. It would mean war once again. In the end, Gaviria concluded that Escobar violated the agreement first by committing the murders, so he ordered Escobar to to be transferred from his luxury prison in Envigado to a real one in Bogota. But this had to be handled immediately before Escobar could find out. Figuring this was not a job for the police but the army, Gaviria ordered the 4th Brigade of Medellin with about 4,000 men to head to La Catedral and take the drug lord into custody. Meanwhile, back in Bogota, the Vice Minister of Justice was ordered to fly to Envigado and meet with General Riza to formalize the transfer. In Narcos, the Vice Minister's called Eduardo Sandoval, but the real guy's name was Eduardo Mendoza. And what Narcos doesn't show is that right from the start, Mendoza's efforts to bring in Escobar were being compromised. For example, he was promised a plane would pick him up at the airport, only to find out that it had no fuel. Then it suspiciously took several hours to find enough fuel in an airport to fill a Cessna. By the time he made it to Envigado, it was nighttime, and worse still, General Riza still hadn't arrested Escobar.
¿Cómo se queda dentro en prisión? No entiendo, se supone que debería estar bajo su custodia cuando yo llegara.
Es que pena con usted, señor, pero esas no eran mis órdenes.
Bueno, ¿y entonces cuáles eran sus órdenes?
Mis órdenes eran asegurar perímetro, cosa de que nadie pueda entrar ni salir. Esperarlo a usted.
Pues eso no es lo que está pensando el presidente, general. Y créame que no le va a gustar para nada saber que Escobar no está en su poder.
Let me explain what happened here. Escobar's intimidation tactics worked so well over the years that nobody wanted to be accountable for going up against him. From the top brass to the lowliest soldier, orders would be tweaked, changed, and improvised, so it would always be someone else's responsibility. And naively, Mendoza thought perhaps he should be the one to step up. So he approached the prison guards, who technically worked for him, and asked to be brought to Escobar so he could convince him to come out peacefully. And I must say, the confrontation between the vice minister and the cocaine godfather is very accurate here. Mendoza walked into the prison and confidently told Escobar that he was simply going to be transferred to a safer one, whilst they made security improvements here. Of course, Escobar didn't buy it, and warned Mendoza that Gaviria was breaking their agreement and any incursion would be seen as an act of war. Then Mendoza excused himself to relay the message to the president, and this part is absolutely true. Just as he thought he was going to walk out, Escobar surrounded him with his thugs. Then Mendoza looked to the prison guards for help, only for them to turn against him too. Taken hostage, Mendoza was told to call the president and urge him to withdraw the army. Of course, Gaviria hung up the line once he knew Mendoza was Escobar's captive. The next thing that happened that we don't see in Narcos is Gaviria ordered General Riza to storm the prison right away. But to his shock, General Riza refused. No excuses, he just simply refused. It was clear the entire brigade was either too corrupt or too scared to make a move. So Gaviria had to order a special forces team to fly from Bogota to Envigado and do it themselves. But when they arrived at the airport, there were no pilots available, so even more time was wasted. When special forces eventually made it to the prison, it was around 4 o'clock in the morning, which couldn't have worked out better for Escobar, because at dawn and dusk, these mountains are covered in dense fog. Except we don't see the fog in Narcos, but keep that at the back of your mind for what happened next. Just after 4:30 a.m., the assault began, as hundreds of Colombian special forces stormed the prison. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed across the complex, as breach charges blasted doors open and rooms were cleared with concussion grenades, leaving anyone inside stunned and easily taken down. A few of Pablo's guards tried to shoot it out with the troops, but they were no match against their overwhelming firepower. Eventually, the vice minister was found lying in a room alive, but in a daze. Mendoza was quickly escorted out of the line of fire and to safety. Now, as exciting this whole scene is, I'm sorry to say that it was nowhere near this action-packed. Only one prison guard was killed, and 2 were wounded. Everyone else left in the building surrendered without a fight, which is the sensible thing to do. Pablo Escobar certainly knew he didn't have a chance. That's why before the assault even began, he and a few of his sicarios escaped through a tunnel.
Less than an hour after Escobar escaped La Catedral, word had spread all over Colombia that war was coming again. But this time would be different. This time there would be no negotiations, no deals. This time, we were going to kill him.
At some point in this episode, you might have asked yourself, hey, wait a minute, why is Nick only talking about Pablo Escobar? Aren't Steve Murphy and Javier Pena the show's main protagonists? Well, yeah, but they weren't really there for much of the events in Season 1. Javier Pena didn't arrive in Colombia until 1988, and Steve Murphy didn't come until 1991, just 3 days before Pablo turned himself in. Originally, I was planning to cover their journey concurrently with Escobar's, but then I realized there was going to be a lot of me saying, whilst Escobar was doing this, they weren't there, which would have been boring. Truth truth is, they didn't have a big role to play until the events of Season 2. In fact, Javier Pena had this to say of Steve Murphy and what they did in their first year working together. "We were not very close, and while Escobar was in jail, we sat during DEA presentations and conducted a few operations, but nothing to equal the magnitude of the Escobar search." Meaning the Escobar search after he escaped from prison. That was when they became best friends and worked together. But even so, the characters are still only loosely based on the real guys. Oftentimes, we'll see them take credit for stuff that other people did. Like when Steve Murphy hands Lara Bonilla that bulletproof vest before he got shot, when it was really US Ambassador Louis Tams. Or when Javier Pena tracks down Pablo's mugshot, when it was really Guillermo Cano, the chief editor of El Espectador. To be honest, I'd say the majority of scenes involving these two is fictional. Having said that, there are some moments in Season 1 that are directly inspired from their personal lives in Colombia and dramatized. One example comes to mind is in Episode 2, when Steve Murphy and his real-life wife Connie land in Bogota, but customs won't let them leave with their cat, even though they filled out all the correct paperwork. The Murphys are held for hours over formalities regarding their cat, but eventually they're cleared. Now, this did happen to the Murphys in real life, but they never found out what the reason was. In the show, it's because the airport staff are bribed by the cartel to photocopy the passports of all the Americans working at the embassy. Then, in an effort to intimidate Murphy, the traffickers do this.
Steve.
Get back. Stay right there, don't move.
If your show is going to be inspired by true events, then I think this is a good way to do it. Aside from being held up at the airport, their cat really did die in Colombia, except it was due to natural causes and not because the traffickers wanted to send a message.
How important is this cat to you?
Excuse me?
Also, their very first night in Bogota inspired another moment in Narcos. Apologize for censoring the sex scene, but it's YouTube. According to the book Manhunters, Steve Murphy wrote, and I quote, "As tired as we were, neither of us could fall asleep. That's when we heard the gunshots outside the boarding house. I immediately grabbed my pistol, but then the shots turned into machine gun fire. I looked at my little weapon and thought, what am I gonna do with this?"
Welcome to Bogota.
Another thing Narcos was inspired by was the hostile inter-service rivalry between the DEA and CIA. Steve Murphy himself admitted that often their biggest obstacle in finding Escobar wasn't corrupt Colombian officials, but their fellow Americans, who viewed their law enforcement work with contempt and trivial when compared to the threat of communism. In the show, they're portrayed to be pretentious, petty, and unwilling to share information unless coerced.
Agent Schroeder will watch you the entire time. Where are the files?
So here we have one of those rare occasions where the truth is more ridiculous than what actually happened. Here's what Steve Murphy had to say in Manhunters. "Whenever we walked in, they would activate a flashing blue light throughout their office space to let everyone know there was an outsider in their midst. We were then required to sit at a child-sized desk located just outside the office of the chief of station and his assistant, where we were allowed to review the data." But in the end, the intel didn't turn out to be much help, because apparently the CIA was just copying a lot of what the DA was reporting, but sending it back to Langley without crediting them. Not only that, but Murphy and Pena even believed the CIA was spying on them. In Narcos, there's an episode where the CIA is following Steve Murphy because he's harboring an M19 insurgent called Elisa Alvaro, but this never happened as she's a fictional character. In real life, they just suspected the CIA tapped their phones because they always seem to know intimate details about their conversations. Also, whenever they hung up the phone and picked up the receiver, they didn't hear a dial tone right away. Just silence for several seconds until they heard a few clicks, and then the dial tone returned. If this is true, then the CIA were breaking the law because it's illegal for them to spy on American citizens. The next thing to inspire Narcos that you might be surprised to learn is that Steve Murphy and his wife Connie really did adopt a baby in Colombia. In the show, the baby is the survivor of a family massacred by Escobar's henchmen, but in real life, the Murphys went to an adoption agency and adopted not one, but 2 little girls. Now, I realize I've spent most of this chapter just talking about Steve Murphy, but believe me, that's not intentional. I tried to find something I could talk about with Javier Pena that's depicted in Narcos, but there really wasn't much. All I could find was the scene when Javier Pena comes into contact with El Navegante, the Cali cartel member sent to spy on Rodriguez Gacha. That bit is true, he really was an informant for Javier Pena, and they had many secret meetings. Funnily enough, Navegante was promised $1 million for providing intel that led to Gacha, but when Pena found out that Navegante was from Cali, he decided not to pay him, as as it would have been unethical to employ a cartel member. But apart from that, that's really it. Everything else about Peña's character seems to be overly dramatized. Like they take the fact that he was single in Colombia but just blow it out of proportion. I couldn't find anything in my research about Javier Peña frequenting a brothel or that he ever shagged his informants, which is not only unethical but a fireable offense.
If I find out $1 single of American taxpayer money went to any of those hookers.
Is your informant really a prostitute?
Are you fucking her? Sleep with a communist? That would be downright un-American.
The only informant he doesn't shag is Barry Seal, and I think that's just because he's straight.
I have a code of ethics when it comes to informants.
Clearly. Anyway, that's all I have to say about these two in season 1. The only other thing worth mentioning is that all the times we saw Steve Murphy and Javier Peña join the Colombian police on their raids, that's not Hollywood fluff, that really happened. They were forbidden to due to US policy, and if they ever got caught, they would have been sent straight back home. But their feeling was that it wasn't right to expect Colombian cops to risk their lives if they weren't willing to do the same. So, in secret, they joined them on thousands of operations, ambushes, and raids in and around Medellin, but they always made sure the Colombians took lead and they hung back, which is what we see in Narcos. Fortunately, I should have a lot more to talk about with these guys when it comes to season 2, but for now, that's another video for another day. Well, that about wraps up season 1 of Narcos. I hope you enjoyed it and stay tuned for season 2. I'm working on the script for that as well, just please be patient in the meantime. I'm writing as fast as I can. Until then, my name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about Narcos. In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.